Grocery stores and food production have no doubt been through the ringer this year. Last winter, no one would have predicted that 2020 would include a mad toilet paper rush, baker's yeast shortages, and lines stretching around city blocks to get into supermarkets like Trader Joe's and Whole Foods.
First, everyone started building little bomb shelter pantries with shelf-stable goods and canned goods. And then we all got into like our national home ec project where we started clearing out the flour and yeast aisle and baking things that were much more elaborate than we used to be baking on a regular basis, probably because we weren't going out and eating out nearly as much.
That's Benjamin Lohr, a writer and the author of the new book, The Secret Life of Groceries, The Dark Miracle of the American Supermarket. It's safe to say that workers at every level of the food production and distribution industry have faced many stressors in recent months, enduring long hours while putting their own health and safety at risk. But at what price?
If you're a grocery worker and you're an essential worker, you're scraping by, if you're lucky, a $15 minimum wage, but that is, as we know, not the case in most of the country. And call them heroes is really patronizing. They're asked to do heroic things and they're asked to put their life in jeopardy, especially at the hottest moments of this pandemic. But it is not a choice that is being made freely. It is something that is being imposed.
The pandemic has led Americans to have a renewed appreciation for employees at every level of the food system who keep the abundant supply of products flowing.
I think people got a sense that this is a miraculous institution that is supplying a level of abundance, low price, and choice that is mind-blowing. This is something that was unprecedented. In fact, when the first American-style grocery store opened overseas, it opened in 1956 in Rome. This was the first one that ever happened outside of the U.S. People lost their minds at the abundance. And this was a small store with only about 2,500 products. But the press report the opening day, the Italian women were running up and down the aisles, shrieking, screaming, "This is heaven," because they had never seen anything like this before. And I do think COVID opened a lot of people's eyes to that novelty again and that kind of miracle behind it, what had fallen into just a mindless chore.
But this vast offering of products comes with a hefty price. It's exacerbated some of the worst qualities of the food industry.
What goes on to create that raft of privilege that the grocery store floats us on? There's an enormous amount of sacrifice going on at every single level. So not just the employees in the store who are working these low-paid, variable scheduled jobs, but at each level of the chain, there is a race to the bottom mentality that often results in cuts to labor, and it gets worse the farther away and the less visible you get. So at the lowest levels, people take advantage of that obscurity, that lack of visibility, and it enables the worst human qualities, and you get really, really abusive conditions.
At the way bottom of the commodity chain are the people across the globe that produce the food sold in the U.S. These workers routinely face hazardous conditions and extremely low pay. In some cases, Lohr equates these circumstances to modern-day slavery.
I go to Thailand and Myanmar to look at the seafood supply chain, and the use of migrant labor there enables true exploitation. And I talked to some men who I think the only word to really describe them would be slaves. They were bought and sold, sometimes out of prison, and then sold on to ship captains, and they were beaten if they wouldn't work, and they were held indefinitely.
Despite laws and policies set in place to curb exploitation, it runs rampant at every step of the ladder. Sadly, to some people in charge, labor costs are viewed as a factor that can be manipulated and reduced if need be.
It's a system that is really structured on behalf of the consumer. At those bottom levels, the first world buyer will come, and every year they're going to try to get a lower price. And if you are a manufacturer, you have to figure out a way to lower your price. And there are all sorts of requirements to play in the global commodity game, from different certificates and safety protocols. And these are all good things, but they mean that one of the few places you can cut costs is labor. And it sets up a system where labor is continuously where the cuts get made, and ultimately that sets up a system where abusive conditions can flourish.
And this troubling system extends past food production and into the distribution chain as well. Trucking is the primary mode of food transportation in the U.S., with 70% of all food being delivered by trucks. But for some of these drivers working around the clock, the industry has trapped them in a cycle of debt and manipulation.
I drove around with a trucker. Trucking is a gargantuan industry, and many of the truckers I talked with were trapped in a system that they described as sharecropping wheels that was essentially a debt peonage that had to do with the burden of debt they took on to both get their trucking license and then to become kind of quote unquote owner operators of their truck, required taking on a lot of debt, and the companies would then manipulate that debt to prevent them from working for other companies and participating in a true free market, or just squeeze out their hours if they wouldn't accept rides at low rates.
If you go a step higher to the most visible employees working in customer-facing positions in grocery stores, the issues continue. While researching the grocery industry for his book, Lohr embedded himself as a front-end employee for Whole Foods.
I also worked at a Whole Foods fish counter for a short stint to just really get the experience of working in the store. And there are a lot of things that came out of that. One, probably most salient, was just how difficult the scheduling process can be for retail workers. I mean, I think most of us carry in our heads, if you haven't worked retail, you have this idea that, of course, it's kind of a low-paying job. It's an entry-level job. But over the last 20 years or so, there's been a shift in how scheduling is done, and that kind of mimics the way that product shipments are done. So people are treated a little bit more like products, which is like highly in demand when they're needed, and there's high demand moments in the store, and then kind of obnoxious waste if there's a slow demand and told to go home.
These changing weekly schedules create an unstable life for employees, and it's not just the grocery industry. Many entry-level workers in every industry are susceptible to this practice.
When I was working, a lot of the people I was working with wouldn't get their schedule more than 3 or 4 days in advance. And the hours that you're working vary from week to week by large margins, 40%, which means that your take-home pay varies. And of course, because not just the volume of time you're working shifts, but when you're working, you can't get a second job to supplement that because there's no schedule, no coherent schedule for your second job to schedule around. And so you become, people are calling grocery workers essential workers now, which I think is lovely, except we don't pay them like essential workers. But you become an on-call worker, like a true essential worker, only without any of the social respect that we give to first responders and other people we expect to be on call.
Illinois resident Jerry Nash spent many years working in the grocery sector in a variety of roles, from baking bread to managing customer service. He wonders, if food is an essential service, why are employees so expendable?
When I worked in the industry, I always felt that, grocery workers were very essential even back then, but not really paid or treated as such. And then, when the pandemic hit, suddenly we realized how important grocery store workers are.
Nash is now the co-founder of Prairie Food Co-op, which is set to open soon in Lombard, Illinois. If you're unfamiliar with a grocery co-op or cooperative, it's a community-based store where the people who shop and work there can buy a stake in the business and then have a voice in the operations. The small business format can be vulnerable to financial challenges compared to big national grocery chains and often relies on committed members making the conscious choice to shop local.
When the pandemic first hit, I myself was really worried about food cooperatives, but it was pleasantly surprising to see that they actually thrived during the pandemic, because I do believe it made people think about where we get our food. It was also very pleasantly surprising to see how a lot of local farms are thriving too.
Nash is a firm believer in co-ops because they put the community first, unlike some big box grocery retailers. They invest back into the community by providing fair wage jobs as well as stocking shelves with items from local farmers and businesses.
Prairie Food Co-op actually did a market study during all this, and we talked to consultants in the industry who have told us that food co-ops have actually thrived during this, because I do believe that people, once this hit, they start wondering where their food comes from, and they start actually paying more attention to their local food sources. Even a lot of local farms that we have relationships with, that Prairie Food Co-op has relationships with, like Rustic Roads Farms or Walnut Acres Farms, now their CSA shares are booming. You go there to pick up shares once a week, and there are lines like out to the road.
He points out that one silver lining to the pandemic is that more Americans are cognizant of their shopping decisions.
Personally, that's why I believe in food co-ops, because they hire more people full-time, they give them better wages, more living wages, and people can actually have livelihoods while working there. I think the model where grocery stores hire younger and younger people and pay them less and less, that's the issue.
So the next time you need groceries, think about how the places you shop and what you buy impacts every person along the supply chain. To learn more about the complexities of the grocery industry and our guests, Jerry Nash and Benjamin Lohr, visit viewpointsradio.org. You can also learn more by reading Lohr's book, The Secret Life of Groceries, The Dark Miracle of the American Supermarket, available now. You can find out more about co-ops and support the future Prairie Food Co-op by visiting prairiefood.coop. This segment was written and produced by Amira Zaveri. I'm Gary Price.
Coming up next week.
We had some students make some really bad choices, including knowing they were positive, deciding to either go to parties or host parties. So this obviously caused a challenge.
Curbing the spread of COVID on college campuses. Then,
think of the application as a package. What's the story that you want to tell in the 5 to 10 minutes that admissions officers are looking at it? That's really what you're after.
Inside the competitive college admissions process, I'm Marty Peterson.
And I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.